Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 1. Well, what was thought to be a leak within this pillar ended up being much more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. You see, customers as well as employees of a grocery store located in Lancaster, California, began complaining about a pungent odor near the front of the store. And as the days go by, the manager notices there is now a leak inside of one of the pillars directly at the front entrance. So he calls up his plumber in order to take a look. Well, upon his arrival, he sort of sits there staring at it for a second and goes, well, look, I'm gonna go ahead and take off a couple of these bricks if that's okay with you, but I gotta tell you, I know for a fact there are no utility lines inside this thing. So after a short conversation, they both agree, and as he pulls back that first brick, this overly pungent odor becomes much more evident, as they notice there is a person crammed inside this thing. This man's name was Raimundo Rivera, and just 5 days earlier, he led police on a high-speed chase directly towards that store, crashing his truck into the side of it. Rivera then exited his vehicle and ran upstairs onto the roof, where he then entered an unlocked maintenance door. Inside this little room, there are two small holes either side, which lead all the way down to the bottom of these decorative pillars. Well, one of two things ended up happening. Rivera either jumped into one of these on his own accord, trying to hide from the police, or he accidentally fell inside while hiding in that room. Regardless, the material inside these pillars becomes thicker and thicker the more they go down, meaning every inch he slipped, more and more pressure would be applied to his chest until he just simply couldn't breathe anymore. Official cause of death: asphyxiation due to chest compression. In addition to this, over the course of the next 5 days, temperatures in the surrounding area had been well over 100 degrees, meaning even if he had survived a couple of days, he would have essentially been baked to death inside of that pillar, placing the pillar incident in the foundation of a series we're calling Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 2. Back in 2012, a maintenance tech is performing a few repairs on one of these giant industrial ovens, and with the way their systems had been working, employees would load up thousands upon thousands of pounds of tuna into the carts shown on screen here. After topping them off, a button is pushed, activating a pulley system which will then draw the carts inside. The door will then close automatically, and the process of baking can begin. Well, as he's working as far away from the entrance as he can, unbeknownst to him, employees have just gotten done loading up about 13,000 pounds of tuna, when all of a sudden, that button is pushed. It is very likely that at this point, the man would have known there was little to nothing he could have done. With no room to slide past, climb over, or crawl underneath him, the weight of those carts slowly working him further and further away from survival and closer towards a most certain death, till eventually the door closes and the heat begins to rise. This man's name was Jose Molina, and for the next 3 hours he had been baked at 175 degrees, ending his life in the process. It wasn't until the carts had been pulled out that he was discovered pinned up at the front of this oven. Bumblebee Foods was cited with a laundry list of violations, including failure to implement lockout-tagout procedures, meaning while Jose was in that oven, the machine should have been completely incapable of being turned on. In addition to this, the company received nearly $750,000 in fines. They were made to pay a total of $6 million to the family of Jose, thus making the Bumblebee Oven incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 3. Just out of sight. Back in November of 2009, a 25-year-old man out of Iowa had just gotten into an argument with his parents. It eventually gets to the point where he straight up leaves in the middle of a snowstorm, wearing no shoes, no socks, didn't even bother grabbing his keys or his wallet, and would never be seen again. That is, until 10 years later. A contracting company out of Council Bluffs, Iowa, is performing some renovations to a now vacant supermarket. And as they're pulling out these giant 12-foot tall coolers, they discover something absolutely horrifying. A man who had long since been deceased had become completely pinned behind one of these coolers in an area less than 18 inches wide. That young man's name was Larry Murillo-Moncada, and it is theorized that on the very day he got into that argument, he ran up in the store, climbed on top of the coolers, and ended up falling straight down into this little space. Now, while he did in fact work at this supermarket, it is said he was not scheduled to be working on the day he went missing, and while his death was deemed to be accidental, they were were never able to determine an official cause. However, it is widely believed he had become so wedged between the cooler and the wall, he simply couldn't breathe anymore. In addition to this, the area on top of those coolers had become sort of an unofficial break spot for employees in the store, meaning that at several points in time, he was quite literally just out of sight, making the no frills cooler incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 4, No Way Out. Jesse and Damien, 2 workers of a Kansas City power plant, have just been informed one of its 3 turbines has begun to lose power. It is believed this sudden loss in power could be due to a faulty purge valve. When functioning properly, this valve should only be open to allow scalding hot, overpressurized steam a route to escape the facility. So after a short conversation, Jesse and Damien grab a few tools and begin making their way towards the room that houses the valve. Now, in order to reach this location, they must take an elevator up a few floors where the doors will then open directly into that room. Little did they know the absolutely horrifying fate that awaited them on the other side. Unknown at the time, that valve had all but completely blown apart, thus allowing this extremely hot, superheated steam to completely fill the room. And we're not talking gradually. I mean, steam is quite literally blasting out of the line. What's worse is, the initial blowback of all of this pressure is currently spraying directly towards the door of that elevator. When they finally open, the steam rolls in, exposing both men to temperatures of well over 600 degrees Celsius, or 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, effectively sealing their fate in the process. In addition to this, it is very likely that as that elevator began to stop, they would have instantly known what was about to happen. As of mid-2021, the family of Jesse Henson was awarded $222 million in a wrongful death lawsuit, with the family of Damien Burchett following close behind, which is why the West Star Energy Steam incident is one of the most. He was found crunched up, frozen in a woman's septic tank looking straight up through her toilet. Friday, February 24th, 1989, a 26-year-old power plant worker had just finished having a conversation with his father. He then explained he had a few errands to run, grabbed his keys, drove off, and never returned. Now, initially, the entire community remained fairly optimistic that he would pop back up with some sort of rational explanation as to why he had been gone for so long. But just 3 days after his disappearance, this case would reach a devastating conclusion. Tuesday, February 28th, a woman discovers a shoe jammed about halfway down a pipe connecting her squatted toilet to her septic tank. She then walked outside through the roughly 8 inches of snow, removed the plate covering the tank, and discovers there is a man curled up in the fetal position, shoeless, shirtless, peering straight up through her toilet. This young man's name was Naoki Sagano, that very same person reported missing by his father just a few days earlier. Now, when the fire department shows up, it was apparent he had long since passed away. However, they had such a difficult time recovering him. They had to rip it up, cut into it, and essentially destroy the entire setup to do so. And if that's not weird, things are about to get taken to a whole new level. You see, the only way he could have gotten into that tank was through a pipe measuring roughly 14 inches wide. And as a pipe layer, I can tell you, very seldom do we ever have a guy that can crawl through 15-inch pipe, and we're talking straight runs, not heading into a 90-degree angle, getting yourself turned back around in order to get in the position this man was in. And many people out there, including the young man's father, have tried to recreate this situation using the measurements provided on screen here, but they simply couldn't do it. Next, he was found to be clutching his shirt, which had been neatly folded laying on his chest. And although, as stated before, one of his shoes was found jammed inside that pipe, the other one would later be found on the edge of a creek in the opposite direction of where he had parked his car, the keys to which were said to have been found still in the ignition. And believe me, look, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but we're getting to the last few details. Minus a few minor scratches on his body, there was no bruising or anything that indicated a struggle had taken place. The official cause of death, hypothermia, deemed to be accidental. Now, this sparked outrage among many within the community, especially his family, as he was then labeled this creepy and disgusting peeping Tom. And a lot of people that knew Naoki just couldn't see him in this light. But I will say this, that woman he would have been peeping on had been gone the entire course of the weekend. and it's quite likely Naoki would have known this as they had already been fairly well acquainted. And it's also worth pointing out, many out there firmly believe Naoki had been murdered, and that some sort of cover-up had taken place. A few of those theories involve other employees of the Fukushima power plant, the local government, or possibly even the woman who discovered his body. Nevertheless, Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 6, A Turn for the Worse. In April of this year, a father had been attending a birthday party at an indoor climbing facility, where, among these many rock walls, lies a series of man-made caves. It is said he, along with his children, decided to give them a go, and while the children had no issues traversing these tunnels, they proved to be a little more difficult for the dad. Nevertheless, as they made their way further inside, one of two things happened according to reports. Here's what went down according to the last of 3 rescue teams called in that day. At some point, the man tried turning around in order to head back out the way he came in. But when he did, pure panic instantaneously sets in, as he has become completely wedged inside this thing. Now, unable to move, struggling to breathe, the man calls out for help. But initial rescue efforts by staff proved to be unsuccessful. It was at this time emergency services were notified, as customers and staff alike began to remove the wall panels in order to access this tunnel. However, it was determined fire rescue was also not equipped for the situation. Unable to free him as well, 2 additional crews had to be called in. Crews that specialize in complex mountain rescue operations, and over the course of the next 4 hours, they would work relentlessly to try and free him. But when they finally did, the damage had already been done. This man's name was Carl O'Keefe, and he would spend the next 8 days fighting for his life prior to succumbing to crushing-style injuries. Now it's worth pointing out, a few articles state he had slipped into one of these tunnels, becoming pinned in the process, while that final rescue team states Carl had tried to turn around. Regardless, I think we can add this to the list of Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 7. Just out of reach. Back in 2002, a guy out of Manhattan had just been out for a night of drinking with a couple of friends. Now, as the night begins to wind down and they're making their way home, an argument breaks out between himself and another member of the group. Well, this argument would quickly escalate into a full-blown fight between the 2 men. And while there is much debate over what actually happened next, here is one of 2 leading scenarios ultimately leading to the same devastating conclusion. It is said that at some point, one of those 2 men, a man by the name of Keith Masters, overpowered the other man, lifting him up and throwing him 15 feet down into an open manhole. And although yes, a fall from this height alone is more than enough to take someone's life, this, unfortunately, was only the beginning of a much bigger problem. Little did they know that manhole had been housing a leaking hot water line that, just a few days earlier, had completely ruptured, effectively leaving the man waist deep in boiling water, while at the same time being completely engulfed in extremely hot steam. And to make matters even worse, although first responders and everyone on scene could hear his cries for help, the steam was so thick and so hot they were unable to physically get to him. It was at this point they began lowering various retrieval systems in hopes he was still able to follow their instructions, but unfortunately, the damage had already been done. By then, he was simply too weak and too injured to comply. This man's name was Kyle McGarity, often referred to as Sean Doyle, and he had spent the last 10 minutes of his life essentially being cooked at well over 300 degrees. Now it's worth pointing out, Keith Masters was originally charged with murder in the 2nd degree, but to the dismay of Kyle's family, those charges were later dropped, leading to a very heated debate as to whether or not he was actually thrown or whether or not he fell. Either way, I think this goes without saying. That is among the most Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 8, Hell or High Water. Back in August of 2021, Hurricane Ida had just made its way through Louisiana, leaving an absolute wake of destruction in its path. And like many, a 71-year-old man by the name of Timothy had elected to stay behind, thus riding out the storm alongside his wife. Now, their biggest concern throughout the course of that storm had been the ever-rising water levels, and Tim had been periodically going out onto his front porch in order to see how close that water line was getting to their home. Well, by the evening of August 30th, the wind had begun to die down. The water levels had stopped rising, and the couple were finally given the opportunity to inspect the rest of their home for damage. With that, they grab their jackets, Tim grabs a flashlight, and they begin making their way towards the front door. But as soon as Tim steps outside, he is snatched by a 12-foot alligator that proceeds to drag him off into the night. Now, while his wife immediately contacted emergency services, she was told they would have to wait for the water levels to recede, as there was just simply no means of accessing that area at that point. With that, they take down a missing persons report, and within just a few days, they begin to receive more and more calls about this giant alligator that had just been roaming around the neighborhood. It was at this time a couple of men came out in order to hunt down that alligator, and when they finally caught it, they would unfortunately find the remains of Timothy inside that beast. Friends and frenemies alike, this has been Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 9. Hisashi Aoji, the most radiated man in history. On September 30th of 1999, Hisashi, along with a few co-workers, had began the process of mixing uranium into enriched uranium to later be used for nuclear purposes. But little did they know, the men had already far surpassed the amount needed of 5.4 pounds, with Hisashi standing over the tank adding in their 35th pound, more than 6 times what was actually needed. When all of a sudden, a bright blue flash rips through the entire room. And while everyone inside had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, Hisashi had been blasted with more than 2 times the lethal dose. Well, immediately, Hisashi can be heard screaming out in agony, as he was instantaneously suffering from immense radiation burns all over his entire body. And within just a couple of minutes, he is also suffering extreme bouts of nausea. Now, during the first few days of his treatment, it was quickly determined there wasn't really much they could do for him. I mean, his DNA had quite literally been obliterated and his white blood cell count was virtually non-existent. It was at this point they sent him to another hospital located in Tokyo. And this is where the true horror began. You see, Hisashi had officially become the most radiated person in history. And rather than keeping him comfortable, they essentially take this opportunity to study its effects on the human body, all the while performing a series of highly invasive tests while keeping him alive for as long as they possibly could. Fairly quickly on, his skin begins to quite literally just fall off. And amid countless skin grafts and various other treatments, absolutely not a single one of them would take. Thus, they would have to end up wrapping his entire body in bandages, which would also have to be periodically changed, in a process that was said to be more painful than anyone could possibly imagine. Well, 59 days after this incident, Hisashi finally went into cardiac arrest. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in a single hour. And against his own will, every single time, they resuscitated him, keeping him alive for another 24 days while continuing to perform these excruciating tests, which brings us to 83 days after the incident had occurred. Hisashi finally succumbed one final time. That being said, this incident, along with the experiments that followed, officially went down as one of the most terrifying ways to go, Episode 10. No Way Out. Back in July of 2017, a group of 6 individuals had just began the process of unclogging a slag tank at a power plant located in Apollo Beach, Florida. Now, essentially, this power plant has these giant 12-story tall boilers, which heat up coal, thus creating steam and generating power. However, this process generates quite a bit of ash, which will then fall to the bottom of the tank, where it is then heated up even more before flowing into a secondary tank. Now, once inside this tank, it is then cooled down with water, turning it into a solid state prior to being ground up and hauled off. Well, on this day in particular, a sizable chunk of solid slag had become lodged at the outtake door, thus not allowing any more of this byproduct to escape, which is why the team had been called in. And at around 4 p.m., they open up the lower door and begin blasting this chunk of slag with water in order to unclog it. But since plant management had insisted on keeping the boiler online, more and more of this molten hot slag just kept draining down into the lower tank, while at the same time exponentially increasing the pressure on the other side of that blockage. And roughly 20 minutes into the operation, all of a sudden, tons and tons of molten hot slag just comes flying out of the end of this thing, completely saturating the 6 workers, leaving them standing in what has ultimately become a pool of lava 6 inches deep and 40 feet wide. And here's where things get even more disturbing. One of those 6 men, Antonio Navarrete, whips out his phone and leaves his mother one final voicemail. "Mom, help me. Mom, I'm burning. Call the cops," with the obvious sounds of sizzling in the background. Tragically, 2 of those men would lose their lives on scene, while the other 4 were placed in medically induced comas from which unfortunately only 1 would survive. In addition to this, Tampa Electric, the company at fault, would reach individual settlements with the victims' families, in accordance with being charged just over $125,000 in fines, officially becoming one of the most terrifying ways to go, Episode 11, Hitoshi Nakata, down to the very last wire. Back in 2003, Hitoshi, a surgeon out of St. Joseph Medical Center in Houston, Texas, had been waiting on an elevator to arrive along with another coworker. Now, one of the lifts in question had been out of service for a few days leading up to this moment. However, to the surprise of both individuals, the doors to that particular elevator began to open. It was at this point his coworker Karen stepped inside and, in her words, Hitoshi raised his arms up almost like he was cheering, while simultaneously stating, "Hey, it's working today." Hitoshi then leans in and begins walking forward. But before he can fully enter, the doors close, pinning him by his shoulders while also locking his head partially inside the elevator. It was in this very moment Karen specifies the look of fear in Hitoshi's face as the floor begins rising directly towards his head. And unfortunately, as she's pushing all of these buttons trying to find the emergency stop, Hitoshi quite literally lost his head above the lower jaw in what can only be described as a Final Destination style incident. Now, the elevators do in fact have a set of contacts on those doors, and if those contacts do not meet, the doors are supposed to reopen, thus keeping the elevator stationary. Well, further investigation would find the incident to be caused by a single faulty wire. In addition to this, that elevator was well over a month past its point of inspection, and the facility had just recently been cited with more than 20 code violations for their elevator. Lastly, it's worth pointing out, this is a version of this story as told by Karen, and it does differ from other witness accounts, including the police report. Terrifying Ways to Go, Episode 12. Daniel Hill, completely submerged. On February 9th of 2019, 54-year-old Daniel Hill said goodbye to his wife and kids, grabbed his keys, and drove off to work at the Michigan Seamless Tube Plant. But unfortunately, he would not be making it back home. You see, one of his tasks that day involved gathering samples from this giant vat of piping hot sulfuric acid. And it is theorized sometime around 12 p.m., Daniel lost his footing, thus he had become completely submerged in the chemical with no way of getting out on his own. To make matters worse, the corrosive substance was kept at temperatures of around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And while no one knows exactly how long he had been inside this thing, what is known is that around 12:20 p.m., he was spotted inside the vat by another worker. It was at this point several employees rushed over to pull him out, receiving minor burns in the process. And here's where things begin to get downright horrifying. While Daniel was able to walk around and talk after being pulled out, by this time he had already suffered severe burns over 100% of his body. In turn, Daniel would spend the next 12 hours in the hospital fighting for his life before ultimately and unfortunately succumbing to his injury. Now, it's worth pointing out, MST, the company at fault, was hit with a $32,500 fine. This was after Michigan Occupational Safety noted 5 citations with more than 63 violations, a list of which included but was not limited to failing to adhere to proper confined space procedures, failure to enforce personal protective equipment, i.e. chemical-resistant goggles, face shields, among other chemical handling procedures, making the MST acid vat incident one of the most terrifying ways to go. Episode 13. Joshua Maddox, claustrophobia to the max. Back in May of 2008, the then 17-year-old Josh out of Woodland Park, Colorado, went on a short walk only to never return again. What's more is another 5 days would go by before his father would actually report him as being missing. And while there is much discrepancy over the reasoning for this, many sources state Josh had actually ran away a few times in the past, and this, coupled with the fact he turned 18 just a day later, they had essentially tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Regardless, a sizable search was launched in the Pike National Forest as well as the area surrounding Woodland Park, and for 8 long years not a single peep, not a shred of evidence is found. That is until 2015, when a construction company was contracted out to demolish a long since abandoned cabin. And this is where things get downright horrifying. Upon busting open the chimney to this cabin, lo and behold, they find Josh deceased, upside down in a fetal position, completely jammed inside, wearing nothing but a thermal shirt. Investigators theorize that for one reason or another, he attempted to enter the chimney headfirst from above, slowly making his way down. However, as the case for many chimneys, this one in particular became more and more narrow the closer you get to the base, meaning that at some point he had become completely lodged with absolutely no way of backing out. More so, even if he was able to get down to the bottom, there had been rebar installed just above the fireplace itself, and now, unable to move, struggling to breathe, he would have continued slipping further and further until he just simply couldn't breathe anymore. The official cause of death is believed to be asphyxiation due to chest compression. However, this is where things get a little more intriguing. If you remember, I was telling you he was only wearing a thermal shirt. Well, the rest of his clothing would be found neatly stacked inside the cabin just beside the fireplace itself. More so, there has been much debate about a metal mesh that had allegedly been attached to the top of the chimney. And although many say there was definitely rebar on the top of this thing, this is simply misinformation. As stated before, the rebar in question was located at the base of the chimney. And although the owner stated there was a metal mesh up top at one point, none of the contractors could say without a shadow of a doubt that it was in fact there on that day. In addition to this, it was also determined a little breakfast nook or countertop had been ripped out of the kitchen and placed directly in front of the fireplace itself. And while many people believe this man right here to be responsible for the crime, there was never any definitive evidence found by investigators, and therefore Joshua's death is still listed as accidental. Regardless, the tale of Joshua Maddox is one of the most